station.
Extraordinary Phenomena Investigations Council presents Epic Voyages. Come join us as we enter and experience the great mysteries of the world. I'm Roger Peacock, your host.
Good evening to you. I'm Roger Peacock for Epic Voyages on Inception Radio. You'll have to excuse me just a little bit. I have a bullfrog in my throat. Ironically, I've been fighting a little bit of laryngitis, summer laryngitis, for the last 3 weeks, so I hope all of our listeners will bear with us. We are so privileged to have a good friend of mine as our guest tonight, world-renowned investigator and former police officer and expert in flying saucers and all sorts of things that we just love to visit about and talk about. Please welcome Ken Storch. Ken, we are really, really glad to have you with us.
Hey, thanks for having me here, and I hope that the listening audience finds it not only entertaining but informative. Let me correct you real quick, Roger. I'm not an expert on anything.
Well, okay.
Oh, okay. I kind of like the attitude that Mark Twain once said about experts, and that is there is no such animal, just different levels of ignorance.
Exactly.
That's all.
That's right. I remember you saying that. I stand corrected. Well, you've been awfully busy.
Yes.
You stay busy.
Yeah,
with our business. You bet.
Yeah, I'm a hands-on type of person. And so I'm not real good at being, as far as traditional research goes, going to libraries, going to presidential libraries like Eisenhower or Truman and digging back in there, although I understand the importance and recognize it, but I kind of like to be out in the field and outside and doing what I refer to as a law enforcement approach to the flying saucer problem. That's where my background lies. That's what I know how to do, and that's how I approach the problem.
Well, you mentioned law enforcement. I know that you have quite an extensive background in that area and investigations. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Ken Storch and how you got started in all of this originally, and just give us a synopsis on your background. I know the listeners are going to find it fascinating. I certainly have.
Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to say hi to a couple of people that are listening. And that would be Alan and Sandy Sutton of Tulsa, and Jessica Matthews of Denver, Colorado. Hi, guys. I got drafted in 1969, and through a set of circumstances beyond anything I had to do with, I just happened to be in the induction center, and the Air Force recruiter come walking down. I was originally drafted in the Army in 1969. I ended up in the United States Air Force. Allegedly, I scored high enough on their aptitude test, putting round holes in square boxes or whatever, and I ended up in the Air Force. And it was kind of interesting because on December 15th, 1969, I went down to do my physical and all that through the induction center, and I took a battery of tests, like I said, for the Air Force, and the guy came out and he said, hey, got good news, bad news. Good news is you're smart enough to be in the Air Force. You don't have to be a grunt in the Army. Nothing against grunts in the Army, by the way. And the bad news is you got to leave like now. And I remember calling my mom and dad on the phone saying, hey, if you want to see me, better beat me out at Lambert Airfield in St. Louis because I'm on my way to Lackland for basic training. Anyway, I really did not have any preconceived notion about flying saucers prior to me getting involved in it. I come from a real conservative rural farm background, so that wasn't something that was bounced around within the inner workings of my family that I grew up in. It was like, I got up in the morning, had chores, went to school, came home, had chores, went to bed. That was pretty much the routine until I left home when I was 18. And initially, I was going to be an air rescue. They being the Air Force had a litany of careers I could pick from, and boy, air rescue really sounded. I was excited, and I went through basic training, and I was scheduled to go to tech school training down in Biloxi, Mississippi, for air rescue and air survival. I don't remember exactly what the terminology was for that, but as I was packing my duffel bag, a lieutenant walked in and said, you scored really high in this other field, and we're going to send you to communications school. It was like somebody just put a pin in my balloon. It's like communications school. What the hell? I have no desire to communicate. All I want to do is, it sounded something interesting in the air rescue. And long story short, I was one, at least this is what I was told, one out of 200 guys that was capable of passing a extensive background check when I was going through Wichita Falls, Texas. That's where the tech school was. That allowed me to acquire a top secret crypto background. And I know I hear this a lot. Well, I had a top secret. Okay, well, as far as I know, at that time I had one of the highest attainable top secret clearances that you could possibly get. And I mean, they being the FBI, went back to my fourth grade teacher, to my grade school, to just a whole host of people. Hell, I couldn't even spell marijuana at that time, much less know what it was. I mean, like I said, I come from a rural background. That wasn't something that was indigenous to the region that I grew up in. If it was there, I didn't know about it. Anyway, I ended up in the Strategic Air Command, and you couldn't have picked a worse career field for me. I went assigned to SAC headquarters at Offutt Air Force Base. And for those that have been in the military, anytime you go to a headquarters base, at least in the Air Force realm, it was a spit and polish organization. Yeah. And Strategic Air Command, I mean, as soon as you arrived on base, you saw everybody walking around with crease fatigues, spit shine boots, the high and tight haircuts, and that's not me. I'm a cut-off T-shirt, sandals, kind of a sloppy soldier. I mean, I press my fatigues. You got to be kidding me. But anyway, I ended up there, and I also ended up working 100 feet underground. It says I worked in the war room. That's incorrect. I worked in the communications room that supplied information to the war room and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The communications center that I worked in, we had what we call the bat phone. That's what we nicknamed it, and it was a direct line to the Oval Office. And I remember very distinctly that there was a sign above the phone, and it said, in case of a declaration of war, do not pay any attention to the voice on the other end. Now, I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what it said. And so the reasoning behind that is that, hey, anybody could imitate Richard Nixon, and that's who the president was at the time when I was in the Air Force. And so we would not take any orders over the bat phone. We were we were, that worked in there under the command of the general of the Strategic Air Command. Mm-hmm. And so part of my job at that time, from 1972 to 1973, was to encode and decode high-priority top-secret messages. I did a lot of, prior to that, I volunteered for every TDY assignment that you could possibly think of, just to get off the off the base.
Yeah.
Wait, I worked 100 feet underground, and like I said, it couldn't have been a worse possible assignment. I wanted to be outdoors. The idea of air rescue, I think I put in 7 requests for transfer, and I was finally told by my commanding officer, hey, forget about it. That's a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. Suck for sack was a blow for freedom, is what I was told, and therefore I was in Strategic Air Command for the rest of my military career. I absolutely loathed it. I despised working underground, no windows. I could go to work in the morning and it would be 75 degrees outside, and get off work 12 hours later and there'd be 12 inches of snow on the ground. Mm-hmm. A complete transfer in the environment. But in 1973, Roger, and one of the interesting things we were talking before the radio show is your sighting that took place in 1973.
My first experience with a craft was in 73 here in Oklahoma, yes.
Yeah, and I found out some other things involving 1973 here just recently. I went and gave a talk down in Piedmont, Missouri, and that's spelled Mizzoura, Missouri.
Mm-hmm. Missouri.
I'm originally from Missouri, so that's why I say
right.
that. But anyway, 1973, as it turns out, was a real active year for flying saucers. And I was working, it was like 3 o'clock in the morning. I was 100 feet underground in the mole hole in the communication center for Strategic Air Command. There was 5 of us on duty. I was at that time, the ranking, I was an NCO, and I was in the ranking NCO in charge of the crypto and the IBM 36020 computer, which means nothing to any of your listeners, but it was a very, in comparison, antiquated, but at that time, top-of-the-shelf, top-line computer system for the Strategic Air Command. A high-priority message came in over the computer, and normally, I say normally, if there is such a thing, there would be, it would come in, and it would come in encrypted. And so I would take the ticker tape that would come in off the printer and then take it back into the encryption room and decode it, and then see to it that it went to its proper destination, whether it was to the General of Strategic Air Command, which was stationed at SAC, or wherever that message was to be disseminated. That was part of my job. Well, in this particular instance, the alarm went off on the computer, which told me that a high-priority, top-secret message was coming in. Now, let me stop right there. I was due to get out the end of December of 1973, excuse me. My enlistment was up, and I was a short-timer, and I had a real attitude. I had enrolled in school. I had bought my books, paid my first semester tuition back in Missouri. I had an apartment, and more importantly, I had a part-time job driving a school bus all lined up. And so I had like a month and a half, maybe 2 months to go in the Air Force, and I was done. And so my attitude was reflected in how I perceived my surroundings with the United States Air Force, and more importantly, Strategic Air Command. I just didn't. I had a gaff attitude. For those that were in the service knows what that means. I didn't care. I wasn't cutting my hair. I wasn't spit and polish. And I come walking into the duty section that afternoon, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was due to get off at 7 o'clock in the next following morning. But the first sergeant was sitting behind his desk when I came into the communication center, and he had this grin on his face like the cat that ate the canary. And he goes, Sergeant Storch, step over to my office, please. And I remember distinctly, like it was yesterday, walking up to his desk and going, hey, you've only got 27 more active days to refer to me as Sergeant Storch, and from that point on it'll be Mr. to you, sir. And he laughed, and he sat back in his chair, and he goes, I think you're going to be with us for a little bit longer. And I remember looking at him going, what are you talking about, Sarge? And he handed my orders to me, and I had been extended involuntarily by the government of the United States, and the reason why is that the Israelis and Arabs went to war. And that's that's really important,
yes,
and how I got involved in the flying saucer problem. I was dumbfounded. I'm standing there thinking, what? I thought it was a kind of a joke, and as it turned out, it wasn't. But the Arabs, it's called the Yom Kippur War, and this was October of 1973. And I just remember going over to my duty station, and I was just, my morale couldn't have gone any further down the toilet. You couldn't have flushed it any more than what it was. It was just devastating to me. And so about 3 o'clock in the morning, this alarm went off on this computer, and I went over to the printer and to the screen, and the heading that came across said, "This is not a test." I don't remember the exact terminology now, but it was printed out in big bold letters. This is not a test. This is a real life situation. We are going to Defense Condition 3. Then it went to Defense Condition 4. Defense Condition 5, they launched the missiles. And I remember reading this header that was being printed out on the printer going, oh, shit, we're going to war. And as I read down in the message, I say normally it would have been encrypted, but since this was being transmitted in real time, there was no time to decode it. They were transmitting this high priority message over a circuit in plain English, basically, and I was the only one in the comm center at that time that had the clearance to read it. The other 4 members that were there they had various different clearances, but nobody had a top secret crypto clearance with an R prefix, and that R prefix stood for restricted information, and that's why I had the ability to pick up the bat phone and call the White House, although I never did that in the entire 5 years I was in the Air Force. I never talked to anybody in the Oval Office. But anyway, the message stated that 5 unidentified objects had been picked up coming in over the Pacific Northwest. And the initial assumption made by higher pay grades than mine was that it was a preemptive strike by the Russians. The Soviets, at the height of the Cold War, were supporting the Arab forces, and of course we were supporting the Israeli forces in this Yom Kippur War. And tensions were pretty tight, and so the initial response was that this was a preemptive strike by a Soviet submarine with ICBMs or Polaris missile type warheads that had been launched somewhere out in the ocean, and they were headed for who knows where in the North American continent. And these objects came in over the Pacific Northwest. They were, 100,000, 200,000 feet up, traveling between 3,000 and 7,000 miles an hour. And during this whole scenario, these objects made several course corrections. And that was predating Tomahawk cruise missile technology. Now, I can tell you, I was aware of Tomahawk cruise missile technology that was being developed in Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, but we had nothing online operational, at least nothing that I was aware of. And like I said, I had that high classification, and I was not aware of anything that the Russians had at that time. And so when these objects made their course corrections, it became apparent that they weren't ICBMs. The stand-down order was given. They tracked these objects all across the United States, up into Canada, and then they went out over the Bering Sea into the Soviet Union. And I know that Richard Nixon picked up his bat phone to the Kremlin Brezhnev was the premier of Russia at the time, and Nixon called Brezhnev and told him that they're not ours, because the Russians were monitoring our strategic nuclear forces. They knew that the fail-safe codes had been given to the SAC bombers. The SAC bombers went to their fail-safe points. The ICBMs the hatches had been blown off the hatches, and that the launch officers had been given the codes, DEFCON 4, Defense Condition 4, they had been given the codes, they had put their keys into the safe and unlocked the codes, and were punching those codes into the targeting computer.
That close.
That close, yeah.
Close.
And a little dovetail this, after it was all over with, my commanding officer came in with two other officers. It was a captain and a major. I was instructed to gather up, I tell my children this, and they look at me like, I'm crazy. I had to gather up all the paper and the carbon paper that the printer had printed messages out concerning this incident. And as I remember it, it was like 3 trash bags, paper trash bags then, and they were marked Top Secret Crypto R. And I gathered it all up, put it in those papers, and the 2 officers that escorted my commanding officer into the communication room took those bags with them, and then I was debriefed for about an hour and a half. And I remember coming out of the mole hole, Omaha, Nebraska, and I immediately went and bought the Omaha World Herald newspaper. There was nothing in the newspaper about what just transpired. And I listened to Walter Cronkite on the CBS Evening News that evening, and there was nothing mentioned. And we came within a gnat's hair of going to nuclear war over 5 unidentified objects. And that started me in. I started reading, studying about, as they call them, UFOs. That's how I got involved in it.
What if you had not seen those course corrections?
I don't know. That's nobody's ever asked me that question, and I really don't know. It would have been. They being the United States, may have launched. I mean, it was a nuclear hair trigger.
Yeah, 30 seconds, and if course corrections had not been noticed or seen or noted, and of course, obviously there would have probably been several course corrections traveling at that speed. But had there not been course correction, there's just a time period there, Ken, of 20 or 30 seconds that missiles would have been launched on either side. I mean, we were that close.
Yeah, that's a good point. You can call back the SAC bombers, although once they reach a certain point, they would not respond to any radio communications, the strategic bombers. But once you push the fire button on those ICBMs, you don't bring them back into the silo. They're on their way. Once they
leave that hole in the ground, they're gone. And,
they're gone.
That close.
Yeah. I, for years and years, wanted to tell my parents, my mom and dad, but I had signed a non-disclosure security agreement concerning that incident in my commanding officer's office, where they debriefed me, saying that I would, keep my mouth shut for 30 years. And I've done that. I never spoke of this until the 30-year limit was up. I was always thinking that one day the OSI would show up at my door, and I didn't need that.
That's an amazing background and experience, Ken. I'll tell you. Wow, some of the experiences and investigations you've had, I know of several of them, and they're just sometimes just boggles the mind. I know that now. I think you mentioned recently that you're going to be doing, or you're opening up, or adding to some of the investigation from the Roswell incident. Is that correct?
Yeah, I had followed, studied, researched the Roswell incident, and Kevin Randall, Stanton Friedman have done some really outstanding research. I think it was Stanton Friedman that initially broke the story back in the late 78 or 82, somewhere in there. I don't remember exactly, but he broke the story concerning the Roswell incident, and as they say, the rest is history. But there's been a number of attempts to attribute mundane explanations to what occurred at Roswell. From weather balloon to a Project Mogul balloon, and I think it was Shakespeare that said a balloon by any other name is still a balloon. Oh, he used Rose. Yeah. But, it's still a balloon. And, the Army Air Corps at that time, as it was referred to, the Air Force, came out and said, hey, we captured a flying disc. And then, 12 hours later, they go, it just was a weather balloon. Mm-hmm. But since that time, there's been a number of explanations that have been put forth as a mundane explanation as to what occurred in Roswell, and most of those come from the U.S. government, which I find kind of ironic. But I had and myself looked at I call them crime scene photographs that were put out by the United States Air Force at the time, trying to explain the debris as being nothing more than a radar reflecting reflector on a balloon trail that went down in Roswell Army Air Base. Those photographs were taken by at least two photographers that were brought in by the United States Air Force, and then the Air Force put those photographs out to the general public. I refer to them as crime scene photographs for two reasons. Number one, it's a government photographer, and the government stands by, yep, those are our photographs. So they had chain of custody of them. And as a crime scene, that was the perpetuation of a lie.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't think there's anybody now that believes that it was a weather balloon or that it was Project Mogul. Okay, and I don't. For your listeners, in 1995, the Air Force came out with Roswell Case Closed book, and I purchased that pamphlet. I think it's like 380 pages or whatever it is, at the Air Force latest attempt to put the Roswell case, the ghost, to bed, so to speak. And I came up with 25, I thought, pertinent questions concerning what they claimed was the explanation, and I sent it off to the Air Force. I have yet to receive any kind of a reply to those questions. And one of the questions that I put forward was that, explain to me how nobody from a private all the way up to General Ramey, the chain of command, that nobody recognized tinfoil reflectors on a balloon trail. And the other questions that I found much more, I think, pertinent for anybody that's been in the military knows that if you have a major FUBAR concerning operations, there is all kinds of policies rewritten and all kinds of extensive OJT training to correct it, to make sure that problem doesn't happen again. And nowhere are you able to find any memos or anything explaining to the other services or the Navy, the Marines, or any of the other joint commands that, hey, make sure you recognize balloon trailing so we don't have another flap of recovering a flying disc. Because keep in mind, it was the United States government that told the world that they had captured